Hi guys, my name is Saharam. If you don't know me, I'm the Brighton Student Union President. I'm here with Luke Frost from our advice team, and we're going to be giving you some top tips and tricks on our complaints procedure. Now, complaints tend to be a very overwhelming task regardless, but with the unprecedented time that we're in with COVID-19 and the tensions rising with industrial action, it can feel like a mammoth task for students and often leads to a lot of distress. So we're here to offer you some top guidance and advice on how to make sure you structure your complaints well. And without further ado, I'm going to let Luke introduce himself.
Hello, hi. So I'm Luke. As Siham's just introduced me, I'm a student advisor in the support team in the Students' Union. So we support students on lots of different things. That includes sort of making complaints, which is obviously what this is about today, and also appeals, mitigating circumstances, lots of different things that we advise on. So what we're going to do today is run through quite a few different aspects of how to structure a complaint, um, pretty much from start to finish, and some of the sort of important caveats and sort of background to bear in mind when you're writing a complaint, especially in this area. Um, and here on the screen, you can see we'll also talk about evidence. We will touch on industrial action as well as COVID-19 complaints, and complaints can be made on both issues at once if it's relevant to you. So we're including that too, and also outcomes and group complaints. And then at the end, we'll sort of talk about the next steps and what we can do from there. Um, I suppose the first thing that we want to talk about here is that we know that a lot of students can be worried about making a complaint, and our response will always be, "Don't be." Your complaint is not necessarily, especially with this, it's not necessarily going to be aimed at the people delivering your course. I know that a lot of students are saying, "Well, my tutors have been working super hard to support me at the moment. I don't want to complain about them." And you're not necessarily doing that in this process. And also because you're writing your complaint, you can say what you like in your complaint. And if you feel like your tutors have done their best, you can say that they've done their best, but at the same time say, this isn't what I signed up for. Um, and also we need to stress like the complaints process, you're protected, from being victimized. Essentially, you will not be marked down for making a complaint. And also there's also worries about the complexity of it, or not sure what to write. I mean, this is what this is about today, and we're here to help you. And later on, we'll be giving you some details on how to reach our advice team if you want us to check a draft or talk to you about your complaint. So we wanted to start with that. Like, don't be worried about making a complaint. Um, and then sort of talk about some of the background here. And we've got our wonderful um, Spider-Man meme here.
Brilliant, by the way.
Thank you. This sort of, like, I saw this in an article yesterday talking about fee refunds in higher education, and it sort of summed it up for me. There's a lot of finger pointing of who should be doing what in this situation, and that can be confusing if you're following along in the press, for example, as a student, reading, the government minister said this and the regulator saying this. It's quite confusing. Um, so in the backgrounds first, before we even get on to any of that, I think the important thing is to consider, like, what is the complaint in this area, and this goes for both industrial action and COVID. Probably a bit more COVID, to be honest, but like, what is at the core? What is a complaint in this area? Um, and it starts with the idea that you signed a contract, so your terms and conditions upon your enrollment and registration at university, that is your contract. And there's a period before you sign your contract, where we call that the pre-contract sort of period, or the pre-course period, where you are being advertised to, as a prospective student at universities, not just Brighton, but other universities as well. And the information you receive at that time is pre-course information or material information. And when we say material information, I'll get onto that in a little bit, what that means. But you made a choice about studying at a certain institution, in this case Brighton, obviously, based on a number of different bits of information, and that can be, as it's listed here, the structure and content of the program, the way the course is delivered to you as a student, the facilities available on campus, and support services available. That's just four of possibly more reasons that you might have, and the question here in your complaint is, well, has the university adequately fulfilled their contractual obligations to you? And that's obviously putting aside the unprecedented nature of the pandemic, and that cannot be ignored. But at the same time, you do have a consumer contract with the institution. You do have a contract that you have signed, and that has terms and conditions on both sides and responsibilities on both sides, you and the university.
I think it's really important here as well to sometimes, for students who are really frustrated, to take a step back and actually park some of the emotions that come with, the time that we're in at the moment. It's very easy to, of course, answer that question immediately and say, no, the university hasn't upheld any of its, contractual requirements. So I think the best advice is really to just take a step back, be rational, reflect on kind of your time at university so far, what's been upheld, what hasn't, and then go from there.
Yeah, I agree. I mentioned material information in the previous slide, and I just wanted to give a definition of what that means. Slightly legalistic term. Basically, it's key information which is material to you making a decision to enter a contract or purchase something. It's material because it mattered to you when you made the decision. So it might be information that caused you to go, right, I want to study at Brighton because they have this or they're offering me that, you know. So the types of material information include the website, the web page that you read about the course, advertising the course to you, the prospectus if you've got one of the paper prospectuses, big fat catalog sort of book, which you find the course page and you are enticed by that, lovely pictures and all of that. Information given to you at open days, and that can be verbal. You might have had a conversation with an individual who told you something and you went, oh, Brighton sounds good for me, or your program specification. And that is a more formal document which you can find sort of on the page for your course on the website, possibly also in My Studies and so on, laying out how the program is structured, how your course is structured. One, we just touched on this, but there is two sides to any complaint. There's obviously your side and how you feel, but there's also arguments going around from other sides in this, and that includes government, that includes the university and the regulators, such as the Office for Students. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on the Office for the Independent Adjudicator, and they're the ombudsman for higher education. So when you have a complaint or an appeal, it you go through stages of complaint and appeal within the university, and once those are exhausted, so you get to the end of that process, you then have the opportunity to take it to the ombudsman. So they then review complaints and make decisions on how they see the case and what they recommend. So I'm focusing on them today. Because they're the ones ultimately that deal with complaints and appeals when they're exhausted internally. So there is this argument around quality, and the word quality keeps coming up when there's discussions around fee refunds, and you might have seen this in the press. particularly, for example, from the university's minister. So the government maintained that if the learning outcomes on your course are being met and the quality is there, then really no refund should be required because you're still meeting your learning outcomes on the course, and will still achieve your degree and so on. And that is I am really reducing this whole debate into a very condensed way for this presentation. It's a bit more nuanced than that, but in a nutshell, that is what it is. So part of the argument is that, if your teaching and learning's been replicated online and you meet your learning outcomes, you shouldn't really be due a refund. But you are still a consumer, and it's slightly contradictory here, but the Office for the Independent Adjudicator is saying consumer protection legislation isn't suspended for students. This means that providers will still need to deliver learning and other services that are consistent with students' reasonable expectations. But then there's a question of what a reasonable expectation is. And there could be an argument of expecting full access, for example, to university services and facilities is not reasonable during a pandemic. And they go on to say, what students can reasonably expect and what providers can reasonably be expected to deliver is likely to change and evolve as circumstances change and evolve, especially if restrictions are tightened again. And I'm quoting there from the OIA. However, is delivering something which they describe as at least broadly equivalent what you were promised? Is the question, I suppose, for your complaint. And at the moment, making a complaint based upon what was advertised to you and what was received is sort of the only thing an individual, and maybe a small group of students on your course, has available to try and enforce your rights beyond writing to your MP, beyond other action you might take. But to address your individual circumstances, this is one of the only things we can recommend at the moment. Hence, this presentation, I suppose. Sihan, do you have anything you'd want to come in on in this area?
I think that's pretty much it. I think you summed up really the definition of quality of education, and I think you highlighted that for the university, their definition may be a bit different to one of students and then the one of independent organizations and structures. So I think we touched on that really, really well.
Thank you. So the OIA have released a few case summaries relating to COVID-19 complaints, and when I say a few, the ones that I thought were relevant sort of to this presentation, there was about 3. They don't release very many, and it's just a sort of a summary of a student's case. It's anonymized, but it does give us some insight in how they're treating these cases once they get to the to the ombudsman. So they said that they took a number of factors into account, and they're listed here. Well, some of them are listed here. What did they do to minimize the disruption? What did the provider promise? And what could you reasonably expect? What did the provider do to ensure that students weren't disadvantaged academically and could achieve their learning outcomes? What the provider delivered and whether it matched what was promised? Was it broadly equivalent? So is that broadly equivalent again to the usual arrangements? And the consequences for students from any shortfall in delivery. So needing to take into account what the consequences were if it wasn't as was promised. And also whether they treated students fairly and acted reasonably as well. And of the 3 that we reviewed, 2 were found not justified. So at the ombudsman, you get this 3 sort of different decisions that you can get. What is not justified, and they will give a reason why that is. One is justified, obviously, the opposite, and that's like fully justified, and they totally sort of agree with the student in a way. And then there's partly justified, so they might agree with one aspect of the complaint, but not another. So 2 were found not justified, and they felt that the university in question had adapted to the circumstances and made reasonable efforts to ensure that students could achieve their expected learning outcomes. So, and obviously we don't know much about that case. It is just a summary. But they did find it not justified in 2 of those instances. And they found one partially justified, and that's where a particular module had not hadn't had the teaching replaced in a broadly equivalent way. Now, there were other modules where the ombudsman said that actually they did do this, but for this particular one they didn't. And the lost teaching wasn't replaced. And the outcome, I think the student got about £1,000, like £1,000. And yeah, so that was what came out of it being partially justified. And we can get into sort of the outcomes side of things later on. But there's an overview of sort of, it isn't as simple as simply saying, I didn't get what I expected, I want a refund. There's more to this that you need to take into account when you draft your complaint. And on that note, then we will move on to talking about how the actual complaints procedure works, and the different stages of that and what you need to do at each stage when raising a complaint. And there are 4 possible stages to a complaint, but we're only going to talk about 2 today. So there's 3 internally to Brighton. Stage 1, the early resolution or informal stage. Stage 2, the formal stage. Stage 3 is a review stage. So if you're unhappy with the outcome of stage 2 and meet the grounds to go to stage 3, there's a 3rd stage, and that is the final stage within Brighton. And after that, you can go to the Ombudsman, which is the OIA.
Luke, so there are a couple of students that may conflate between whether or not they've written an appeal or they've written a complaint. Could you distinguish between the 2?
Yeah, so an appeal is, the grounds for appeal are very restrictive. It has to be about an assessment. It has to be about something going wrong administratively in the assessment process, or something similar to that. It's focused on grades and your outcomes of your assessments, whereas pretty much everything else is a complaint. And sometimes those things can be conflated, and you can have something that is an appeal and a complaint at the same time. We'd advise, you should seek advice on that sort of thing. If it involves your assessments and your assessment outcomes, you should definitely seek advice, because it might be that you need to do an appeal and a complaint. But generally, when it's about the provision of your course and the quality of your teaching, or access to facilities and things like that, that's a complaint, because it's not. It might have an impact on your assessments, and you can mention that, but it's primarily focused on the service you're receiving rather than a problem with the grading and marking and assessment of your work and your progression on the course. Yeah. So we're just going to cover briefly what happens at each stage of the 2 stages we're going to focus on. The first one, early resolution, we're going to focus on this stage the most in this video, because we are advising students to sort of get everything down from the beginning, because it will save you time later. You essentially submit a written complaint to your school complaints officer. If you don't know who that is, your school office can let you know who that is. If you struggle to find out, you can always contact us and we can find out for you. That can be an email, which you can write like a letter, or you could go into Word and you could write it as a letter in Word and attach it to an email. It's up to you, but it should be structured quite formally, a bit like a letter, rather than just sort of like one big paragraph. You should give it some real structure, so the person reading it can fully understand what you're saying, what you're arguing. And you would also attach your evidence to the email. So when you email to the school complaints officer, you have your actual complaint, and then your evidence attached, however much it is, you would attach that. And you can also request a meeting to discuss your complaint with the SCO, the school complaints officer, at stage 1, and that enables you to have a dialogue with them about how you are feeling and what your issues are. And then you would eventually get a response at stage 1 in writing, and if you're dissatisfied, you could take it to stage 2, which is the more formal stage and involves an investigation. There's a form you would need to fill in, and we'll go into this later on, but the sections of the form should allow you to sort of replicate a lot of what you've said at stage 1, but at the same time, you would then also respond to anything that was said by the school or by the university at stage 1 that you don't agree with. So your complaint is unlikely to change radically between stage 1 and stage 2, so it's okay to repeat it. But if they respond with an argument that you don't agree with, you would then sort of need to explain why you're dissatisfied with that at stage 2. And once you submit your stage 2 form, the instructions of which are on the form itself, your complaint will be dealt with, or should be dealt with, within 90 days. And then if you're not satisfied with the outcome, there are the further stages, as we mentioned, stage 3 and the ombudsman, but we'd advise you to come to us for advice at that point. Your complaint's likely to have advanced beyond just the early stages, and you need individual advice, really. So yeah, just to recap, you need to go through all of the stages as normal. You can't skip stage 1. You still need to go through it. We would like to say that it's very likely your complaint will need to go to stage 2, because we're finding that they're not going to offer compensation or tuition fee refunds at stage 1. They will require you to advance to stage 2. And like I said, we want those stage 1 complaints to be as detailed as possible to save you time at stage 2. And you can send drafts of your complaint at any stage to us for advice, and you can do that by emailing BSU support service at brighton.ac.uk. And it's useful to let us know a bit about the background of how you're feeling. We might need to suggest an appointment with you to talk to you about that, or we could just check your draft and provide some feedback on it.
Now, just a question about how our advice team works in the procedure on our end. Do we offer, it might be worth clarifying for students, that does one person take on your case and then carry it forward until it's been resolved, or is there the whole team working on a collective, a diverse range of different cases, and you guys liaise within the team to make sure that the best possible outcome is delivered?
It's a bit of both. So generally the case will stay with one person, but that doesn't mean we don't have access to the rest of the team to get advice from, or ask for recommendations and share with. So we have we have a meeting every week, casework supervision for particularly tricky cases. We will discuss together as a team and share best practice, and also try to find the best solution and resolution for the student. So it's a bit of both. It does generally sit with one advisor, but it doesn't mean it can't change between advisors if someone's off on leave or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Okay, so that's an overview of the sort of 2 initial stages, and now we can talk about the actual structure of your complaint if you're going to be writing one, and we need to stress that there should be a sort of standard sort of flow to a complaint. There's sort of like a logical way of setting it out, and it's difficult to describe, but we've tried here to sort of break it down. And that flow is sort of starting with the facts, and sort of leaving out the emotional side, which is important. How you feel about this is important, but for at least the beginning, just sort of laying out your position factually is quite helpful. And wherever you make a point as you're doing that, you want to refer to your evidence as and when you mention it. So imagine I say, I'm referring to the start date of my course, just as a simple example. I started on the course on the 1st of September 2019. I might then say, bracket evidence 1, close bracket, and that refers to a numbered piece of evidence, which is, I don't know, the email saying I start on the 1st of September or whatever, giving a number to each piece of your evidence, especially if you've got a lot of it, is really helpful to whoever's reading your complaint, and they can go immediately to that evidence and refer to it. So it's almost like Harvard referencing for your complaint, and you're just sort of referring to your evidence. You might not have a lot of evidence, but it is still useful to number it, just to help the person reading it understand. And if there's a series of events, then going through that chronologically rather than jumping through time. Because if you do jump from time to time and jump all over the place, it could be quite confusing for the person reading it who doesn't know your situation. I suppose in a complaint, it's sort of your role to help that person to understand your position, so you can so they can understand how you feel, essentially. And yeah, once you've got through the sort of factual explanation, that's where you'll start to explain how you feel about it, and that's also your argument. So as we said here, you've outlined your facts. Now you can explain how you feel and why you think what has happened is wrong. And then the final part of that is the outcome. What do you want? And I know that sounds quite blunt, but the question, the best way to put that question is, what do you want to happen? And what do you want as an outcome from this complaint? And here's an example structure in a similar way. So for a complaint like this, an introduction, a very brief summary perhaps, what was advertised and promised pre-contract, what your actual experience has been, the problems you're now facing, how that's affected you in your studies, why you think you've not received what was advertised or promised, or not what you signed up for, and what you'd like to happen now. What do you want, essentially? And that can be the structure. And as I said before, try not to jump from point to point rapidly. If there are different issues, so imagine you have one issue about how a particular module has been structured, and there's a whole chronology of what has happened there and a series of events. But then there's a similar issue for another module, similar but different issue for another module with its own series of events. It might be best just to break those down into 2 different sections with little headers underlined, like I have here. In this example, it's the module specification. The module specification for module X1234 states that it would have 40 hours of teaching in the laboratory, and so on and so on. But that's separate from a section about the prospectus. So prior to starting the course, the prospectus for 2021 academic year stated I would have access to, and on and on. And you can break it down into different areas to make it easier for the person reading to understand what your point is. And finally, around the structure, you don't have to be super exhaustive. It's good to be thorough, but if you are repeating yourself again and again, it can become confusing and a little draining to read. And you don't, if you've already given a really good example, which is sort of illustrative of a wider problem, you don't need to exhaustively go over every single thing that happened, because you've given an example. You can say, this is an example of what has happened. There are other instances, there are other times, there are other problems, but I'm giving you evidence for this. If you'd like to see more evidence about those other times, then I'm happy to give it to you. But for now, I'm just going to focus on this as an example. That's fine.
Yeah. I think collecting evidence is clearly going sometimes the most overwhelming part of a complaints procedure, because by the time you've actually collected the right amount of evidence and then getting to writing the complaint, it can somewhat feel like, what's the point? So I think a little top tip for students is really to I would use the timetable. So go back, you have the opportunity to go back to your in your timetable and actually have a look through your timetable at what are the what modules, what lectures and seminars did you miss out on, and for what reason. Going through that week by week, as tedious as it may sound and it may be, is actually probably one way to get rid of the emotional aspect and just make this less of a daunting process, and so that you can actually get to writing the complaint and not feel that, tired and stressed out. Because often that's, I think, what the case is that students want to write out these complaints, that they want to, they want to get the compensation they deserve, but there's just kind of this question, this cloud of stress and panic and anxiety, and they just end up saying, okay, well, what's the point in the end? So I think it's just about, like Luke mentioned, taking out the emotional aspect of it, going through your timetable, going through your module handbook, seeing, okay, what have you missed out? What have you actually, had? And just go from there, really.
Yeah, I'd agree. And also with beyond like missing sessions, going through your timetable like that might help you. Like, I think everybody's losing track of time a little bit at the moment, and it's hard to remember when stuff happened and when you felt a certain way. So going through your timetable might also remind you of like, okay, maybe in September I did have access to this facility, but by that point where we had that seminar, we've moved back online again, and I no longer had access, or the lockdown came in. I think everyone, knows roughly when, the November lockdown or the January lockdown and so on, but it can help. And I think that's a good tip. And I agree. One final point on this: a longer complaint is not necessarily better. So if you have a 500-page complaint, which you won't, but if you did, that would be very difficult to read. And you must bear in mind that there is a person on the other side of this who will investigate, and making that person and helping that person understand your position is important. And yeah, so longer is not better necessarily. Say what you need to say, but it doesn't need to be totally exhaustive. We do have a few more points about what to actually cover. So that's sort of the structure, but there's more to say about what you can actually sort of focus on in your complaint in this area in particular. We have a few bullet points here that we can sort of go through, and this might not be relevant to everyone. Some of this might be relevant to you, some of it might not. But for example, how you feel your studies have been affected is just generally. But then, has online teaching been adequate and of good quality? Come back to that question of quality. And in this, when you're writing your complaint, you can be the arbiter of what that is and what that means to you. But if you feel like it hasn't been, why not? And provide examples and evidence where possible. Concerns about whether your assessments have been or will be affected. That could happen. So if that does happen, list the assessments and explain what happened. If, for example, if you feel like deadlines should have been postponed or extended or something like that, then say so, and say why. If feedback has not been provided on time or yet to be provided, not able to contact academics or supervisors, again, evidence should be there for that if you've emailed people and they've not got back to you or something. If there's any teaching or content which is in the prospectus or in your program specification or anything that you've seen that is no longer going to be delivered to you, you might want to express your dissatisfaction about that, especially if it was a significant factor in you choosing to come to Brighton and study that particular program. And if you're unable to access any facilities, especially those that are key to your course, that could be labs, workshops, equipment, and so on. There's an argument here that, okay, I might meet my learning outcomes. I might be able to do things from home. I might be able to get through this that way. But when you were advertised the course, you were advertised access to these fantastic facilities that you no longer can access, and that can't be replaced now, particularly if you're in third year, for example, or something like that. So, or in your postgraduate course. So you need to sort of consider that and how that has had an impact on you, and how does that made you feel? And do you feel like you got what was advertised again?
I think it would be really important to mention here, if you're someone who, for instance, if you're living at home or you're commuting and actually using services such as the library, were actually a real important part of not only your well-being, but your kind of, ability to reach, your potential when it comes to your assessments and your assignments. That's something that I think would be really important to add as well, because access to space is often something that a lot of students come back with and say, well, at home, yes, I'm living at home, but I don't actually have the space to study. I don't have the space to do these assignments. And as a result of the pandemic, as a result of libraries being closed across the country, I haven't actually been able to fulfill X, Y, Z. So don't be ever ashamed or, to mention these things, because they actually add a lot of weight.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then on top of that, there's also this final point here, which is about support services in the library and so on. And yeah, I agree. Like, if those spaces have been important to you socially, that can't be ignored. And I think that has fallen by the wayside a little bit. People saying, well, nobody can socialize at the moment. It's like, okay, but that is an aspect of university life that is important and is a draw. So it can't be ignored. But yeah, I mean, access to the likes of wellbeing and support services in the library, those are services as well that are part of your part of the offer to you as a student. So if you haven't been able to access those and that hasn't been mitigated in a way that you agree with or that you think was good enough, then you can bring that up too in your complaint. And finally, sort of, if you're not happy with your department's attempt to mitigate the impact on your studies, if you don't think the steps have been enough, I'll just return again to that initial slide we had where we said, if you think they've done their best and you don't want to sort of point fingers, that's still fine. Like, you can say they've tried their best, but it just hasn't been enough for me to feel like I've got what I signed up for. That is okay to do. And with regard to industrial action, if this is relevant to you, and you may be making a complaint about COVID and industrial action, or only industrial action, you should refer to any evidence, such as like emails you've received from your department about cancellations of lessons or changes, messages on Blackboard and so on. You could take screenshots of those, and that can be part of your complaint. And if you have any other evidence that relates to the impact, or inconvenience it's caused, then you should mention that and provide the evidence for it. And now we're going to come on to evidence, and here we have Charlie from Always Sunny in Philadelphia looking for, or trying to figure out who Pepe Sylvia is. You need not have a wall full of evidence and different like red markers and everything. You might not have as much. You might have some students might have a lot of evidence, some might have less. But what we have explained earlier about the web pages, the prospectus, the open day information, your program handbook, your course handbook, there will be some evidence somewhere for you that you can refer to. And those will be examples of material information or pre-contract information. I just want to give some more guidance about this. I know we touched on it earlier and we touched on it a few times. With regard to the website, the university website, the page advertising your course might not have changed substantially since you signed up, and you might not remember. But you can download a PDF copy of that page, so you can press, Control P or print or whatever, and print to PDF and save it on your computer rather than printing it out your printer. And there's also a website this won't work for everyone, and it won't work for every page. But there is a website called archive.org/web. They call it the Wayback Machine. And there's these sort of like algorithms that sort of search the web and take little snapshots of websites every so often. The more popular websites are properly archived, and pages at the different universities not necessarily touched as much, but there are sometimes earlier snapshots of pages in the Wayback Machine that might coincide. Well, basically, you get a little calendar, and that might coincide with when you were looking at joining the course. And you can download a PDF version of that too, and that will be what you actually saw at that time. So that's useful. The prospectus, you might still have a paper version of your prospectus somewhere. It's likely you won't, but if you do, that's useful. You could use your phone, take a picture of it or whatever, the relevant pages that you want to refer to. If you can't find it, but you did know that you looked at one and you've binned it or you've lost it or something, I think we could probably get a copy for you if you wanted, so you could contact us. The information at open days is more likely to be verbal, but that's okay. You can still refer to it. If you remember who was saying what, then say who that was, giving their name if possible, which I know might make you feel a little uncomfortable. But that will kind of be what's expected. And also, you're not getting that person in trouble. If it was pre-pandemic, especially, well, they probably didn't say anything different to what you would have got had the pandemic not happened, for example. So yeah, and your program spec, your module handbooks, and your course handbook. The program spec, you can find that on the university webpage advertising your course, but it might also be in Blackboard. But your module handbooks and your course handbooks are definitely on your course page in my studies. So on Student Central, so you can go there and get those, and they will give like a breakdown of what was to be delivered on those modules. You should be able to compare those handbooks and the specifications to what you've actually received, and it should be quite useful to you. And we're going to touch on industrial action here. There's a picture of a UCU picket, but UCU are not the only union that go on strike, but it's, I think, the main action has been UCU recently. So you can include strikes in your complaint, or you might be making a complaint that is only about industrial action and not COVID. If that's the case, by the way, if you're only making a complaint about industrial action, this all applies to you as well, really. Like it's about industrial action and not receiving certain sessions, maybe, rather than the impact of COVID. But if it's both, or one or the other, our recommendations at the moment for future strike action is to wait for that to finish, so that you can actually log and record what's happened first, because you won't know the full impact of it until it's done. Okay. But we're suggesting you make a log of it. If the strike's in the past, you can try and go back and do it retrospectively, using a similar method to what CM said. You go back through your timetable and figure that out. So, but if it's upcoming strike action, keep a short note of each time something affects your learning. That could be on a piece of paper, in a book, and in your phone. I'd recommend a spreadsheet or a table, to be honest. But if you're on the go, then in your phone could be a good one. And what to record? Really simple. Just the date, the module code, and the name of the module. What was affected? Like, is it a seminar? Is it a revision? Is it a supervision session? Like, what is it? A short note of any concerns you have about that and how that could affect your studies. And if the description has cost you anything, then it could be your travel costs, or if you had a note taker because you've got DSA and you've sort of lost that. They were ready, they were sitting there ready to do it, and it's last minute cancelled or something, then you should record that too. And don't worry too much about being really thorough. Well, obviously, I'll rephrase that. Be thorough, but you don't need to write loads and loads and loads. And this will become evidence in a complaint because you've been making this log as you've went along. It shows the impact on you. And in a complaint about industrial action, you can actually mention some previous OIA decisions that were made about prior strikes. And again, we go back to those case studies that they published. And these are the case citations for those that are on the OIA website, and the amount of money awarded to each student in those cases. I think the larger amounts, so 1,200, 1,100, are probably international students, because I do know that some of those cases had slightly higher awards because of the higher rate of fees for international students. But yeah, those are the rates there. And yeah, just on that point, then we'll talk about outcomes. And we are getting towards the end now of our presentation. You need to carefully consider what outcome you're requesting. I always say it's the most important part of your complaint. That's not true. Like, your complaint is the most important part of your complaint, but like telling them what you want. You can't just say, I have all these problems, I'm really not happy with this, and then nothing. You need to tell them what you expect from it. And the OIAs say you need to be realistic about what's possible in these unprecedented times. Okay, but if you think something is fair and you want to include it and you think it's reasonable, that's fine. Then you include it. So what we've got here is just some suggestions of what you might want to look at, and the most common ones, which is a refund of tuition fees, a compensation, other alternative resolutions about your studies that are not money related, and compensation for unexpected additional costs incurred directly as a result of the circumstances. And that might be things like DSA funding, or it could be some students have been saying, well, I can't get access to my accommodation because of this, or I'm paying for housing and then I can't access it. That's a trickier question. You can still include it, but I've heard an argument recently, was from the government actually. They said, well, we give you maintenance loans and grants to pay for that, and actually that was as a result of a petition from people to the government, and they've been told to respond again on that one. But that's a tricky issue, but you can include that sort of thing. You're going to come in there soon.
Yeah, and I was just going to reiterate, when it comes in terms of accommodation, we are, as an SU, lobbying the university to reconsider its position on the accommodation rebates for semester 1 and semester 2. At the moment, they are offering a 60% rent rebate in third semester for the hours, for the time lost in accommodation in semester 1. That more can be done, particularly now that we're moving into perhaps an extended lockdown until March the 8th. So that's definitely under review at the moment.
Yeah, on fee refunds and compensation, we have to be quite general here because this changes depending on your course, depending on who you are, like an international student or a home student. We're basically saying calculate the proportion of fees or compensation you're requesting, and that's taking into account the proportion of teaching and services delivered as normal or close to normal outside of lockdown. So if your complaint is particularly focused on access to facilities, for example, but you did have access to them at some point, you need to be proportionate. Rather than asking for the whole amount of fees, you might need to reduce that and be more sort of realistic there. You can work out from the fees you've paid for the term or the module, or part of the year, and then work backwards from there, proportionally. And you could also factor in any measures taken by a department to reduce the impact before deciding what amount you consider to be appropriate. There is no exact science here. It's what you think is reasonable. But we do need to warn you about this caveat of the OIA in previous industrial action cases reduced the amount awarded in compensation by about half. So they would come up with a figure saying, okay, for this module and this amount of hours lost to industrial action, it's this amount of money proportional to your fees. We're going to reduce that by half to take into account the university needs to maintain its buildings, IT, library, well-being, and other staff costs and stuff. And for one of those coronavirus related complaints that I saw, the one that was partially justified, they reduced it by 30%. And I don't know why it was 30%, not 50, or I'm not sure how that number was arrived at because there's just not much information there, but they did do that. So you might want to take that into account as well, even at the earliest stage of what you're asking for. Do you have any points to come in on there?
No.
Alternative resolutions. So these include things like that are not necessarily monetary, but are to do with your studies. So like taking a break from your studies for a year or something like that. But in that case, you'd probably be asking what is known as repeat performance, so that the university allow you to repeat the year. It's not your, by the way, it's not your repeat performance, it's theirs. It's them repeating their contractual obligations to you by not charging you for the year, but allowing you to repeat the year, possibly during a time, fingers crossed, where things are different and things are better. Next year, for example, from September or something like that. You would need to consider if a repeat like that is viable for you financially, and we'd advise you seek advice, particularly, for example, from the student advice team in the university, who deal with sort of like financial advice. They'd be the best people to go to say, well, what would the fee implications be? What are the implications for me here financially? And then think about like how would that affect your career aspirations and other responsibilities. I'm sure that will be at the forefront of your mind. We don't need to tell you that. But yeah, consider how that will affect you later. So those are some alternatives to just straight up saying, give me tuition fees back, or I'd like compensation. It does involve compensation because you're asking them to waive your fees essentially for another year, but it's slightly different. And we just want to touch on group complaints because there's a slightly different way of doing those. You can make a complaint collectively. The regulations actually say exceptionally you can do this, but there's nothing stopping you submitting a group complaint. And essentially, it's the same as everything we've talked about, but I suppose it would be more general because we're talking about a wider range of people. You will want to agree on common outcomes, I suppose, across that group of people. Like, what do we all want? Each of us want X, Y, and Z. And when it comes to evidence, students are likely to share some of that evidence. Some people might have examples that they can provide. And you just sort of label that as like, this is evidence from this student, and use that as an example to represent everybody, if everybody's been affected by the same thing. And you would nominate a lead complainant. I would advise that if it's larger than, say, 10 people, that maybe 2 or 3 people work on the complaint together and help, because it's lonely just doing it as one person. That's a lot of pressure just for one
Yeah.
person to do. Maybe 2 or 3 people, and then you still only have one lead complainant, which liaises with the university and submits the complaint and does the sort of legwork there, but they're supported by a few other people. And then everybody else and everybody involved in the complaint needs to sort of agree to what's written in the complaint, agree to the outcomes, and also sort of give and provide written consent, which is shared with the university, to say, and this is from the policy, that it's okay that their complaints can be discussed with the group's nominated lead student, and the complaints office can share the full unredacted complaint outcome report with all students who are party to the group complaint. The university needs to check that a student hasn't just went out and just put everyone's name on a complaint. It needs to have proper signatures and proper agreement. And yeah, this is our sort of final section. What's next? So I've said earlier, you know, we're able to provide further advice on a one-to-one basis. That might be as simple as checking your draft and providing some overall sort of advice. It might be more complicated. It might be that we need to talk to you, but we're here to help you. Here's our email address again: BSU support service at brighton.ac.uk. And what's next for you? So once you submit your complaint to the school complaints officer at stage 1, so that's the sort of letter style complaint that we've been talking about, you can also request a meeting to discuss your complaint. If you would like someone to come with you for advice from the Students' Union, you can request that from us at the address I just mentioned, and you'll receive a written response to let you know the outcome from stage 1. It's very likely you'll need to take your complaint to stage 2. That could happen very quickly, in fact, because they might see your complaint and see that you're asking for compensation and immediately say you need to go to stage 2. Don't let that put you off. Don't let that dishearten you. That's fine. Then complete the stage 2 form, which is pretty simple. If you're just repeating yourself, copy and pasting, that's fine. But remember, if you have received a more robust stage 1 response, which has sort of responses to your complaint that you don't necessarily agree with, you need to outline that in the stage 2. You can't just copy and paste your stage 1 again. You need to actually expand on that. And that stage 2 form has a few sections. So like a summary where you're asked to summarize briefly what your complaint is, previous actions that you've taken, and you would explain, well, I've went through stage 1. This is what I've tried to do to resolve my complaint so far, and your preferred outcome. And you can repeat your outcome there from the first stage. And that's it. That is an hour-long sort of, in a nutshell, this is how you make a complaint. Thank you for listening.
I think here what we've done really, and well, I say we, I mean more so, you know, Luke, so thank you for your efforts really, is that we've highlighted the detail, just the sheer detail that goes into these complaints. It's not just as simple as I'm unhappy, I want compensation. There is so, you know, there's so much context to it. There's so many things that, you know, as a student you need to consider before, you know, even writing these complaints. But that doesn't mean that it should be overwhelming and daunting and something that you just do alone and it feels like you're almost sinking by yourself. And I hope that with this video and you know, we'll hopefully break it up as well and create it into a series that will actually, you know, boost a bit of confidence and morale in some of these students and boost, most importantly, the kind of confidence in our student union services, which ultimately is what it boils down to. I think confidence and that reassurance that actually this will hopefully go somewhere, provided that the structure is there, the context is laid out, the evidence is, is there, and that, I think that's what ultimately it boils down to. So thank you so much, Luke, for all of your efforts today. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm sure many students will actually benefit from the content that we've provided. And as always, if any of you have any questions, queries, please reach out to me, please reach out to Luke and Luke's team. The HelloBSU email as well, hellobsu@brighton.ac.uk. And we look forward to supporting you and continuing to support you and represent you in every single way.